In a time ruled by steel, fire, and fear, warriors didn't just fight, they shaped the fate of kingdoms. From legendary knights to brilliant tacticians, these medieval champions stood out not only for their strength, but for how they changed the art of war. This isn't fantasy. These are real warriors, real battles, real blood. Get ready to meet the 10 deadliest medieval warriors in history, ranked and explained. Number 10, Hereward the Wake. In the chaotic years following the Norman conquest of England, one name stood out in the eastern marshes: Hereward the Wake. He wasn't a king or a noble with vast armies. He was a local thane from Lincolnshire who turned into one of the most effective guerrilla leaders of the 11th century. His base of operations? The wild, waterlogged fenlands around the Isle of Ely, a natural fortress that would become a symbol of resistance. Hereward's genius wasn't in open battle. It was in knowing his terrain better than anyone else. The marshes were nearly impassable, full of deep bogs and narrow causeways. Hereward turned this into a battlefield advantage. One of his most famous tactics involved setting fire to reed beds around Ely. The thick smoke blinded advancing Norman forces, forcing them off the few solid paths and into the mud, where their heavy armor became a death sentence. Men and horses simply sank. The Normans, led by William the Conqueror himself, were so frustrated by this resistance that they had to engineer special siege towers on floating platforms and lay timber roads just to reach Ely. These weren't typical military moves, they were acts of desperation. The sheer effort and cost it took to overcome Hereward's defense show how serious a threat he was. Although the full details of his life are clouded by legend, the core story of a rebel turning local knowledge into military strength is historically sound. His actions were not just a footnote, they forced the Normans to adapt their tactics. Hereward's legacy endured not just in chronicles, but in folklore as a symbol of native resistance. In an age defined by conquest, he became a rare voice of defiance, and one that the conquerors could never entirely silence. Number 9. Harold Godwinson, last Anglo-Saxon king. In 1066, England stood at a crossroads, and at its center was King Harold Godwinson. He was the last Anglo-Saxon to sit on the English throne, a warrior king forged by crisis. When news arrived that a Viking invasion had landed in the north, led by Harold Hardrada, Godwinson acted fast. He marched his army roughly 300 kilometers from London to York in just 5 days, a pace that would be considered extreme even by modern standards. The effort paid off. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold's forces launched a surprise assault and decisively defeated the Viking army. It was one of the most dramatic turnarounds in English military history, but Godwinson had little time to celebrate. Just days later, a second invasion force landed, this time led by William, Duke of Normandy. Without pause, Harold turned his exhausted army around and marched south again, covering nearly the same distance back to face a fresh and well-prepared Norman army. At the Battle of Hastings, he arranged his troops in a traditional Anglo-Saxon shield wall. This formation relied on discipline, heavy axes, and tight cohesion. It successfully absorbed multiple Norman cavalry charges. For hours, the English held firm. However, William's forces began to use a tactic of false retreat, drawing parts of the English line out of formation. Once the shield wall began to break, the Normans exploited the gap, eventually surrounding and killing Harold. What makes Harold Godwinson stand out isn't just that he fought 2 major battles in the span of 3 weeks, it's that he almost won both. His leadership, physical endurance, and ability to inspire troops under impossible odds marked him as one of the most formidable field commanders of the medieval period. Number 8. Sir John Hawkwood. Sir John Hawkwood was an English mercenary captain whose name became legendary across Italy during the 14th century. After beginning his military career in the 100 Years' War, he took his expertise abroad and became the leader of a feared and highly disciplined group known as the White Company. Hawkwood didn't just bring brute force. He brought a tactical mind that fundamentally shifted how wars were fought in Renaissance Italy. One of his most famous innovations was the creation of what some called a moving fortress. This wasn't a real structure, but rather a carefully organized column of troops. He placed infantry and crossbowmen around the outer edge of the formation, with cavalry and supplies protected at the center. As this formation advanced, it created a kind of mobile battle unit that was extremely difficult to flank or surprise. Think of it like an armored train on foot. Slow, steady, and devastating. City-states like Florence recognized his value. Instead of spending months or even years laying siege to castles and fortified towns, they paid Hawkwood enormous sums, up to 13,000 florins a month, to carry out fast, destructive raids that achieved similar results in a fraction of the time. That's equivalent to about 7 tons of silver per month. These campaigns were brutal but effective, and they saved cities both time and resources. Hawkwood's reputation wasn't built on blood alone. He was respected for his professionalism, discipline, and strategic thinking. He rarely engaged in battle unless the odds were in his favor, and he was known to negotiate, threaten, and maneuver his enemies into making mistakes before a single weapon was drawn. In many ways, he was a precursor to the modern military commander. Someone who understood that war was as much about pressure and positioning as it was about strength. Number 7. Sir John Chandos. Sir John Chandos was one of the most brilliant and respected knights of the 14th century, often remembered as the strategic mastermind behind some of England's greatest victories during the Hundred Years' War. He served as a close companion and military advisor to Edward, the Black Prince, and was known for combining courage on the battlefield with sharp tactical judgment. One of Chandos's most famous moments came during the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. The English forces were outnumbered and facing a powerful French army. Rather than confronting the enemy head-on, Chandos devised a plan that would exploit the landscape and confuse the enemy's momentum. He deliberately allowed the French knights to take the initiative, drawing them into a narrow path surrounded by thick hedges and thorn bushes. As the knights advanced, English longbowmen, hidden on both sides, opened fire at close range. The heavy French cavalry was trapped, unable to maneuver or protect themselves effectively. After the initial wave broke down, Chandos led a charge of dismounted men-at-arms to finish the job. It was a rare combination of defensive tactics and calculated offense. The result was a decisive English victory with the French King John II taken prisoner, an event that shocked Europe and shifted the war's momentum. Chandos wasn't just a battlefield commander. He was also a diplomat, a trusted negotiator, and someone deeply respected by both allies and enemies. His death in a minor skirmish in 1370 was mourned across England. Chroniclers of the time wrote that when Chandos died, it was as if half of England's luck had vanished with him. His legacy lives on as a symbol of the knight who used his mind as skillfully as his sword. Number 6. Edward I Longshanks. Edward I, often called Longshanks for his imposing height, was more than just a powerful monarch. He was a military reformer who reshaped how England waged war. One of his most significant achievements was the creation of a strategic network of castles across Wales during his late 13th century campaigns to subdue and control the region. These weren't random fortresses scattered for show. Each castle, like Caernarfon, Conway, Harlech, and Beaumaris, was part of a calculated military system. What made this system groundbreaking was its integration. The castles were positioned to support one another and connected by a series of supply roads, allowing troops and materials to move quickly and safely through hostile territory. This structure became England's first true forward operating base network, laying a foundation that would influence military planning for generations. But Edward didn't stop at stone and mortar. He also reformed the very structure of his army. Through a series of royal orders, he introduced a more balanced composition of forces. Every manor was required to supply not only a mounted knight, but also 5 hobelars, light cavalry riders trained for speed and flexibility. These hobelars could scout, raid, or pursue fleeing enemies more effectively than heavily armored knights. This blend of heavy and light forces added depth to England's battlefield tactics. Edward's reforms showed a clear understanding of both long-term occupation strategy and the importance of mobility in medieval warfare. He knew that castles alone couldn't hold a country. You needed roads, reliable logistics, and soldiers adapted to different kinds of combat. It was this combination of architectural ambition and tactical foresight that earned him a lasting place in military history. His model would influence not only later English kings, but also military commanders across Europe. Number 5, Edward, the Black Prince. Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince, wasn't just a royal figure. He was one of the most formidable commanders of the 100 Years' War. His military career was shaped early, and by his early 20s, he was already commanding English forces in France. What set him apart wasn't just noble birth, but how he used England's longbowmen to change the battlefield. The longbow, made from yew wood, required incredible strength to use, with draw weights ranging from 160 to even 180 pounds. This was no simple bow, it was a war machine. A skilled archer could send a heavy, armor-piercing arrow over 100 meters, capable of punching through up to 3 millimeters of steel plate. Against the heavily armored French knights, this was a game-changer. Before the Battle of Crécy in 1346, Edward's forces prepared in a very deliberate, calculated way. Archers were drilled to fire in tight rhythm, hitting wooden shields over and over. The result was a thunderous, steady beat that came to be called a drum of fire. It wasn't just training, it was psychological warfare. That deep, constant sound could rattle the nerves of approaching enemies long before arrows flew. At Crécy, the Black Prince positioned his longbowmen in a staggered line across the slope of a hill. The terrain slowed the French cavalry, and the archers fired in waves, a storm of arrows that devastated mounted charges before they ever reached the English line. The result was one of the most lopsided victories of the age, with thousands of French casualties. Edward's use of the longbow wasn't just effective. It marked a shift in military power away from heavily armored nobility to well-trained common soldiers. It was tactical, brutal, and revolutionary. Number 4, William the Conqueror. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, launched one of the most significant military campaigns in European history, the Norman invasion of England. But what made William more than just another ambitious warlord was his exceptional use of combined arms tactics and logistics that were far ahead of their time. On the battlefield, William didn't rely on brute strength alone. Instead, he carefully structured his forces into 3 rotating waves. First came the archers, who launched volleys to disrupt and weaken enemy formations. Behind them, light infantry advanced to press the front lines, forcing the enemy to commit. Finally, heavy Norman cavalry, the knights, charged through weakened gaps. This method of alternating pressure wore down even the most disciplined forces, such as Harold Godwinson's elite housecarls at the Battle of Hastings. One of William's most underrated innovations was his resourcefulness with materials. After crossing the English Channel, he ordered his ships, originally Viking-style longboats, to be dismantled and repurposed as parts of mobile siege towers and fortifications. This practice of military upcycling allowed his army to move quickly and set up fortified positions using the very vessels they had sailed in. It reduced the burden of transporting extra materials and turned potential waste into battlefield advantage. William's attention to logistics was equally remarkable. He ensured supply lines ran efficiently from Normandy, securing provisions, weapons, and reinforcements. His ability to feed and equip a full-scale invasion force across the sea while maintaining momentum in enemy territory set a new standard in medieval warfare. His victory at Hastings didn't just win him a crown, it introduced new military structures, reshaped the English aristocracy, and laid the foundations for centuries of Anglo-Norman rule. William the Conqueror wasn't just a king by conquest. He was a master tactician who understood that battles are won, with brains as much as with blades. Number 3, Richard I, Lionheart. Richard the Lionheart stands as one of the most iconic warrior kings of the medieval era. Known not just for his bravery, but for his discipline and command on the battlefield, His reputation was earned through strategic brilliance as much as sheer courage. One of the clearest examples of this came during the march to Arsuf in 1191, during the Third Crusade. Richard was leading his army along the coastal road from Acre to Jaffa, a route exposed to constant harassment from Saladin's forces. Most commanders would have risked disorganization under such pressure, but Richard held a tight marching order over 17 kilometers. His troops were arranged in compact units with heavily armed knights and infantry, while crossbowmen protected the rear and flanks, keeping enemy horsemen at bay. What made his leadership stand out was his control over timing. Despite repeated provocations, he ordered his troops to stay in formation, refusing to be drawn into a disorganized fight. Then, at the right moment, just 2 minutes after the pre-agreed signal, he launched a coordinated counterattack. His knights surged forward in a disciplined charge, cutting through Saladin's cavalry and scattering the enemy lines. The quick, explosive move turned the tide in seconds. At the heart of this operation was Richard's elite force, a 200-man household retinue. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were hand-picked, well-trained, and fought side by side with the king himself. Their loyalty and precision made them a model for future European knightly orders. Richard's victory at Arsuf wasn't just about winning a battle. It showed what disciplined command, psychological control, and tactical timing could achieve in the chaos of medieval warfare. It wasn't brute strength that earned him the name Lionheart. It was mastery of the battlefield. Number 2, Henry V at Agincourt. In the autumn of 1415, King Henry V faced overwhelming odds on a narrow field near the village of Agincourt. His English army, weakened by disease and exhaustion after a long campaign in France, stood vastly outnumbered by a well-equipped French force. Yet it was here that Henry would secure one of the most famous victories in medieval history, not through sheer strength, but through planning, terrain manipulation, and ruthless efficiency. Understanding the terrain was key. Henry ordered his men to cut down nearby trees and use the timber to craft sharpened wooden stakes. These were driven into the ground at a 45-degree angle, forming a deadly forest of obstacles in front of the English lines. Planted into soft, freshly churned soil, the stakes were positioned to break up cavalry charges and slow advancing troops. The rain-soaked fields of Agincourt turned into a trap. As French knights charged, the muddy ground pulled at their feet. Their heavy plate armor, weighing up to 30 kilograms, became even more burdensome as wet clay clung to their legs, adding an estimated 2 to 3 kilograms of extra weight with every step. The French attack, funneled through the narrow field and broken by stakes, lost momentum quickly. English longbowmen, positioned behind the protective stakes, rained arrows into the ranks. It wasn't just the weapons, it was timing and control. When a group of captured French knights was seen as a risk, potentially picking up arms or stalling the English position, Henry made a grim decision. He ordered them executed. It was controversial even at the time, but it allowed his archers to refocus on the fight. This cold, calculated move demonstrated Henry's sharp military mind. At Agincourt, he didn't just win a battle, he rewrote the rules of medieval engagement. Number 1, William Marshal. William Marshal, often called the greatest knight in history, was more than just a warrior. He was a living embodiment of medieval chivalry, strategy, and statecraft. Born around 1146 into a minor noble family, he rose through the ranks not by inheritance or politics, but by unmatched skill on the battlefield and remarkable loyalty to the crown. What truly set Marshal apart was his undefeated record in tournaments. 55 victories without a single loss. These weren't the ceremonial games of later centuries. Medieval tournaments were brutal, full-contact training grounds for war. Knights could be unhorsed, injured, or even killed. Yet Marshal dominated, earning ransoms from defeated knights and using the wealth to fund his own military household. His most famous moment came much later in life at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217. England was in chaos. The French had invaded, and a boy king, Henry III, sat on the throne. William Marshal, at the age of 70, was named regent. Not only did he organize the defense of the crown, but he led the charge in person. Marshall commanded a wedge formation of heavy cavalry, a shock tactic unfamiliar to English warfare at the time. As they stormed into the city, crossbowmen fired from rooftops to cover the advance. The result was a decisive victory that turned the tide of the war. But Marshall was more than a commander. He was a political stabilizer. After King John's turbulent reign, Marshall played a crucial role in reissuing the Magna Carta and restoring trust between the crown and the barons. He acted as a bridge between the old feudal world and the emerging legal framework of England. His wisdom and moderation earned him deep respect, even from former enemies. In the final chapter of his life, Marshall took vows as a Knight Templar. He died in 1219 and was buried in the Temple Church in London, a place still visited today. His tomb effigy shows him in full knightly armor, sword by his side, shield resting across his chest, a symbol of the era he helped shape. William Marshall wasn't just a legendary fighter. He was a reformer, protector of royal authority, and the very model of what a medieval knight could achieve. His story blends courage, intellect, loyalty, and innovation in a way few others in history can match.